Good morning to all of you. Uh, our today's session. Okay, today's class is on South Africa from apartheid to the reconciliation. To briefly talk about, what this entire lecture is going to be. The lecture is going to be a history of almost about 100 years, right from the beginning of the 20th century from 1900 to almost till 1996, when the apartheid regime of South Africa is thrown away by after a very, very long struggle, a prolonged struggle by the people of South Africa, and also by the support of various other, organizations, international organizations of political parties, which were formed for to continue this struggle. Let's begin South Africa. If you know, I'll be taking you through the world map. This is the map of the world. And if you look at the South African country, this is where South Africa is. This is the African continent. And South Africa is the southern tip of the African continent. And this region in the beginning of the 20th century was not one single unified country. It was an amalgamation. There were various smaller regions within this particular region at that time, and some of these regions were like Natal, Transvaal, Cape Colony, etc. So this region, I reiterate, this particular region is where is South Africa is. Now moving to a closer map of the South African country. This I've just zoomed into the to the lowermost tip of the African continent. What we were seeing here, this part. Look at the cursor. This part. Now we are moving to the specific map of South Africa. This. So as I said that, at this time in the beginning of the 20th century, this was not one single unified country. There were various different regions, like you can see this Cape Colony, you can see the Orange Free State, you can see Transvaal, you can see Natal. So these 3-4 states, also there are various other regions, but these 3-4 states play a very, very important role in what becomes South Africa and what continues after that. This is the broad geographical description of South Africa. Now, if we talk about, before I begin with today's lecture, if we talk about who were the people who were living here, if we talk about the composition of the population, the demographic composition, what was the religion, what was the ethnic composition of the people who were residing in this part of the world. Now, if you can see the demographic composition of South Africa, the demographic composition of South Africa was comprised of people who were mainly blacks. So blacks composed the majority of the population, and these blacks were internally diversified into various different tribes. Like there were Zulus, there were Tisjongas, there were Zuhus, there were Figos. So black, when you refer to the term the black community, it doesn't mean one single community. The blacks were internally diversified into various communities at that time. As I said, that there were blacks, then there were people from the Indian community, there were people who migrated to Africa as laborers in the previous century, in the 19th century, during the colonial rule. Both South Africa and India were part of the British colonial empire. तो जिस तरीके से हिंदुस्तान पर अंग्रेजों का हिंदुस्तान अंग्रेजों के साम्राज्य में शामिल था, उसी तरीके से दक्षिण अफ्रीका भी अंग्रेजों के का जो साम्राज्य था उसमें शामिल था. सो द ब्रिटिश एम्पायर एक्सटेंडेड टू वेरियस कंट्रीज ऑफ द वर्ल्ड as we know them today, which are also known as the Commonwealth countries, and South Africa was a part of that country. So during the 19th century, uh, as the black community of South Africa was almost, they lived in an economy which comprised of self-sustenance. They were self-sufficient economy, self-sufficient households. So there was not much labor available. So when the British wanted to establish plantations of various kinds in South Africa, the labor was not available. And this labor was brought in from India, because India also happened to be a colony of the British at that time. And the laborers from Madras, from Calcutta, from Awadh, so basically, from various regions of India were moved to South Africa. And by this time, by the 20th century, they there was one composed Indian community in South Africa. As many of you would know, that Mahatma Gandhi also spent the early part of his life, in South Africa. The other major community in South Africa was the colored people. Now, these colored people were the comprised of the mixed race, the various descendants of people from various ethnic communities, like the Indians, and also specifically, sorry, just to point out, when I say the Indian community, this is not not only the people who are from India, but also from basically the Indian subcontinent. Pakistan and Bangladesh were also part of India at that time, undivided India. So these colored people were basically the next category, which is the colored people, were people who were who were descendants of whites getting married to Indians, Indians getting married to blacks. So all these combinations of races due to intermarriages and their children, these comprised of the colored people. And last, here in my list is the white community. Now, these white community, who are these people from the white community? These are the descendants of the people who came in from the European countries, people who came from Britain, people who came from Netherlands. So these British and Dutch people, people from Netherlands, are known as Dutch. These settled in South Africa in these various different regions that we spoke about: the Transvaal, Orange Free State, Cape Colony, Natal. So these white community, Indian community, etc., were all scattered in these various different regions. Now, two things to remember before we go ahead is that both the black community and the white community were internally very, very diverse. We have already talked about the diversification, the diverse composition of the blacks, that they belonged to various tribes, and they were often, fighting against each other due to various issues. The same is true for the white community as well. The white community too belonged, because they belonged to two different regions of Britain and Netherlands. So they were British and Dutch, and also the fact that they belonged to different regions of South Africa. Some were from Transvaal, from Cape Colony. They were internally, they were at war. They were fighting battles at several junctures between amongst themselves. Uh, okay, to give you the background of this lecture, what we are going to talk about is apartheid. Now, what is apartheid? We are going to talk about it in a little while, but what happens, how we begin, is we talk about the Anglo-Boer War, the war which is basically the war between the two states of Transvaal and Orange State, the four states that we talked about. Out of those two states of Transvaal and Orange State, they fought a war with the British, and though ultimately the British won the war, it became almost apparent that South Africa will have to emerge as an independent country. So it will have to be given its independence. Now, what this South Africa would look like, how will these four states of Transvaal, Orange State, Natal, and the Cape Colony be organized in this new country? Will it be a union government? Will it be a federal form of structure? Who would be the people who would be in power? What kind of rights will there be? What will be the kind of government? Now, all this was needed that all this should be decided before the freedom is ultimately granted. Uh, so a national convention was held by the white community, who were, as I said earlier, who were internally, almost fighting wars before this. So a national convention of the whites of these four regions was held on 12th October 1908. Now, this is after the Boer War, because it is being decided that South Africa will emerge as an independent country, and we need to decide on the structure or the form of government which this new nation is going to take. So the whites met in a convention on 12th October 1908. And they drafted an act known as the South Africa Act. And there was resistance to this act by the black community because the blacks were not included in the National Convention, which was confined only to the whites of the South Africa. So the blacks resisted this act of, whatever this new draft was made of the South African country, what it is going to look like, what its form of government is going to be. And there was an important personality when this act came to be discussed by the whites itself. There was somebody known as W.P. Schreiner, and he said that the union that this South Africa aspires to make is a union without honor. This union which they are making does not respect the rights of various communities which are part of South Africa, and this you cannot have a country which does not recognize the rights, does not give honor to the various population that comprise that country. And he said that this union without honor will not be able to survive for a long time, and thus what we need is a union with honor. Nonetheless, not much attention was paid to what Schreiner had to say, and the act, which was formed by the whites and passed by the National Convention, was sent to the British for passing the act, because it was ultimately the British who had to grant the independence to South Africa. This act was sent to Britain because Britain had to take the final call, and the black community of South Africa thought that this is a very important opportunity, because now we can address our problems, our issues to Britain, because whites did not pay heed to it. Now we can address our concerns to Britain. Maybe Britain is going to pay attention to what we want, the kind of constitution we want for South Africa, the kind of country we want South Africa to be. But Britain also did not pay much attention to the demands of the black population of South Africa, and ultimately the draft which was presented by the National Convention was passed as it is. So not much changed, and the draft which the white community sent through the National Convention was passed as it is. So this made it very, very clear that the new government which is going to come in, which came into being after South Africa emerged as an independent country, was very, very repressive to the black community and to the other people of other communities in South Africa. They brought in laws. I mean, this particular new after the South Africa Act, the new country took away the right to vote, which was earlier available to the black community of South Africa. So one thing which is happening is this new nation is coming into being. And not only the fact that the demands of the blacks and how their aspirations to what kind of country this new South Africa should be was not paid much attention to, but along with this, the voting right, the right to vote and form the government, which was already available to the blacks and the other colored Africans of South Africa, was also taken away with the coming of the new act. So new South Africa, so the South Africa is formed, and the voting rights of these two communities are taken away. Along with this, what also happens is a new act is passed, which is known as the Land Act of 1917. Now, this Land Act of 1917 deprives the black community, the black Africans, to hold any kind of property, and it also deprives them of right to vote. It takes away their right to vote. Now, this is the time when the black community will start getting together, and they would want to organize themselves to be able to raise their demands, to be able to consolidate their demands, and to be able to raise them in an appropriate manner to the leaders of this new South Africa. An important person here was Pixley Ka Isaka Seme. Pixley Ka Isaka Seme was a lawyer, and he was trained in Britain, and he formed a body known as the Native Union. And he made this call to various different tribes of South Africa, the various different tribes of black Africans, to come together and oppose these new laws which the new government was bringing in. He told how these laws were repressive to the black community, and till the time the black community is not united, they will not be able to fight this battle against the repression which is being brought to them, which they are being subjected to by the whites of South Africa. Seme, as I said, was a very, very important leader. He asked the black community to end their internal fights. Like, there were fights between the Zulu and the Figo tribes. There were fights between the Zulus and the Sajongas, and various others. They said that he said that if we continue to fight among ourselves, we are only giving the whites the opportunity to rule us the way they want to repress us, to not pay attention to our demands, and it is very, very important that we should get united. And it is to the efforts of this gentleman that a political party known as the African National Congress was formed in South Africa. So this African National Congress was formed in South Africa. I just want to show you the just a minute. Okay, I hope you guys can see the screen. So this African National Congress was formed due to the efforts of Seme and various others. It was formed in January 1912, specifically on 8th January 1912, formed by various three important people: Pixley Ka Isaka Seme, John L. Dube, and Saul Palache. These three important people. Now, Seme, as I told you, was a lawyer. The other gentleman was an educator, so they were philosophers. They came from the educated classes. African National Congress led a very long struggle on behalf of the black community against the racial segregation policy of the South African government. It provided a unified leadership. As I said, that blacks, as Seme also said, that blacks are diverse, fighting amongst themselves, and if they continue to do so, they will not be able to win their rights or get their rights from the white government. So it unified the black population and provided a leadership to the black community. It fought for the rights of the blacks, and it also fought for a constitution which they wanted should be democratic and it should be anti-racial. So there should be no racial segregation in South Africa, and the constitution which should be brought in should be a democratic constitution. This party was banned by the National Party. National Party comes to power in 1948. We are going to discuss about the National Party when we in this lecture in great detail, because it stays in power right from 1948 till 1996, and this is the party which officially brings in the policy of racial segregation, of apartheid. Though, as I said, okay, so National Party brings in the policy of apartheid as a state policy in 1948, but it was quite visible that the new South Africa, which emerged after the South Africa Act passed by Britain, in which only the white community had this say, and the various acts which were brought in, especially the Land Act, which was brought in 1917, made it very clear. It created the basis for the racial segregation between the whites and the blacks, and also of the colored races of the Indian community. So it separated these demographies into different zones. So at this time, it was not an official policy, right, in the beginning of the 20th century, but by 1948, when National Party comes to power, it makes apartheid or racial segregation of the black population and others from the whites a state policy. And this makes the African National Congress to fight a very, very long battle against this policy of apartheid. Now, what is this apartheid? Let's look at that. Uh, Apartheid is a word in the African language, language of the Afrikaans as it is called. It is the term which is used for apartness, something which is apart, something which is separated. It was a system of legislation, as I said, this it being emerged, emerged as a state policy only after National Party came to power in 1948. But it was a system of legislation that upheld the segregationist policy against the non-whites citizens of South Africa. So the whites would be on one side, and all the other communities, the blacks, the coloreds, and the Indian community on the other. So this segregation, which is going to emerge in various walks of lives, in their modes of transport, in the clubs they go to, in the educational institutions, in the places of residence, all walks of lives was separated, segregated, one for the white, the better, the more privileged, the better conditions prevailed for the whites, and all the other communities, the three communities which comprised the major chunk of the population. So white community in South Africa was a very, very small community in terms of population. And the major chunk was that of the blacks, colored people, and the Indians. As I said, 1948, National Party is going to make it an official policy, which National Party was was a government which was that of all white. So it was an all white government. And it started bringing in different laws. And we are going to talk about various laws that they bring in, say, Repression of Communism Act, and various other acts, which they bring in to officially, implement this policy of separateness, of apartness between the whites and the blacks. Under apartheid, the South African, which were the Africans, which are the majority of the population, were forced to live in separate areas from the whites and use separate public facilities. Apart from this separateness, this was also a time, apartheid was also a time, this racial segregation, of the state also in effect meant a horror for the black population. They were arrested, they were tortured, and they were arrested without committing any offense. The quantum of punishment which was given to them was almost always never in proportion to the crime that they indulged in. They were sent into custodies without even proper trial in the court of law. They were killed. Many of them were killed, and there was no reporting of these acts of terror by the state. Now, all this torture is being done by the state. They could not organize themselves. There was restraint on their freedom of expression. They could not get together. So very, very repressive measures of the National Party right from 1948. Uh, Despite strong and consistent opposition to apartheid within and outside South Africa, the laws remained in effect for the better part of the 50 years. So right from 1948 till 1996, when the apartheid comes to an end in South Africa, when South Africa becomes a democratic country, which adopts a constitution which is non-racial, which is anti-racial, till that time, this span of almost 50 years, it remained as the policy of the state. Now, this, I hope you get some sense of what apartheid means. Now, just to give you a glimpse of how it looked like in public life, to give you the images, because images are extremely powerful and they remain with us for much longer. Uh, I would want to show you a few images. Uh, okay, I hope you guys can see the screen. Now, if you see, there are these posters which are being, these, hoardings, boards which are being put up in place. Caution, there are natives which are living here. This is a white area and the blacks are not allowed. This particular picture shows about the protest which particularly the African National Congress is going to lead for almost 50 years against the policy of apartheid. Now, if you see this, there were separate ways to walk for the blacks and the whites. There were separate taxi stands. If you look at this bench, this seat, it was different for the blacks and for the whites. This show gives us a glimpse of how the black population used to live. Look at the small, the squatters, very rickety household structures in which the black population lived. Uh, I guess that's about it. So how they are stuffed in in the transport, so they would be usually all of them would not be allowed to travel in the first class, as the very famous incident of Gandhi, despite having a first class ticket, was not allowed to travel in the first class compartment of the train, and he was thrown out, after which he led a struggle in South Africa. So this gives us some sense of what apartheid means, what living in South Africa at that time meant. Now let's continue with the lecture. Just give me a moment. So we were talking about the formation of African National Congress, how it was formed by SEM, who said that it is important for us to organize ourselves, to forget about the differences which we have amongst ourselves. We may be divided, but if we want to fight a common enemy, we must get united. Now, this struggle, for us to familiarize ourselves with this particular struggle, it sometimes helps, if we draw a parallel with the Indian freedom movement. For several reasons, for reasons because India also was internally divided into, various regions. People spoke different languages. Many a times they would be fighting amongst themselves, and how the role, to some extent, there is a similarity between the role played by Indian National Congress in India to fight the independence from the British, and the role played by African National Congress in South Africa against the policy of apartheid. Now, the African National Congress was not fighting against the British; it was fighting against the all-white government, specifically of National Party, which was there in power from 1948 to 96. So they were fighting from against the white population, and here the Indian National Congress was fighting against the British for independence. But the way in which both these congresses, the Indian National Congress and the African National Congress, bring together people and are able to sustain their demands, for a very, very long time. They are able to take up the struggle and live with it and fight for it, for against the repressive policies for a very, very long time. It is very similar to what the Indian National Congress was doing. One thing which draws them apart is that African National Congress at some point of time became extremely militant, took up arms, and almost emerged like a militant movement, to liberate South Africa from the repressive government which was there. Indian National Congress does not assume the same militant character, does not really take, popularly does not really take arms to get freedom from the British. Okay, this is just to, make it, easy to comprehend to some of us who may be finding it too alien to think about a different country altogether. Okay, so coming back to South Africa, the blacks, this is the time after the formation, the second decade of the 20th century, the various blacks are coming together, the people of the black communities are coming together, and there is also some bit of patriotism in the whites of South Africa. And they are also thinking about, the conditions of the blacks, and how so the blacks started talking about the fact how they are facing the measures of this white government in their daily life, which has taken away their right to vote. At this time, this is right after the formation of South Africa. It was almost understood that this South African country was is going to the kind of economy it is going to have. So the ordinary working class comprised a major chunk of the population there. And this is the time when Russia would have the Bolshevik Revolution, and there'll be establishment of the Soviet Union, USSR as it is known. So this is a time when the communist movement internationally is going to become very, 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 very strong, and they tried to make some gains in South Africa as well. And since South Africa already had a working class population, and it also had a South African Communist Party, which was operational in South Africa, and it tried to show the South African population a dream, for them to imagine a native republic, a republic which is formed by which is composed of the people of South Africa itself, of people who are workers, of people who are peasants. So this is what the South African Communist Party is trying to float in 1920s, 1928 to be specific. This concept of a native republic, a republic which is of the laborers, of the workers, of the peasants in South Africa, and not a white republic. This was, in fact, the concept of the annual report of the South African Communist Party. Now, this is what happened in the 1920s during, right after the world went through depression, the Great Depression. In the 1940s, when the world faced a war, the Second World War, there was an agreement which was which was done between the two major powers at that time. This agreement was done between Britain and USA. So Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of Britain at that time, and Franklin D. Roosevelt was the President of United States of America, and they came up with the charter in 1941 in the middle of the Second World War. They drafted a charter and they signed the charter, and there were various points in this charter. Uh, this is we are moving away from South Africa for a moment, but we'll come back to it because this particular charter is extremely important to talk about the South African history. So a charter was signed between Roosevelt and Churchill, and there were various important points which were put down in this charter. Now to give you a glimpse of what this charter was, the major points of this charter. Uh, Let me just share the screen with you all. Mm, just give me a moment. Okay, so as I told you, during the Second World War, a charter was signed between Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of USA, and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of United Kingdom. Why is it called the Atlantic Charter? Because it is the Atlantic Ocean which separates these two nations. Both are on the either sides of the Atlantic Ocean, so it is known as the Atlantic Charter. There were various things which included in this charter. One of I'll be just you can go through it. It is there on your screen. I'll be just reading it. What this charter stood for. Some of the major points were that discarding of attack and seizure of any foreign territory. So there will be no seizure of foreign territory during this war. The boundaries of any nation cannot be altered without the consent of the citizens involved. So if there's any nation which is losing a war, gaining in the war, you cannot alter the boundaries of that particular nation without the consent of the population which is there. Now, there is a history to this charter. Why these conditions were put in the Atlantic Charter. We cannot go into that history, but this will give us the glimpse of this will give us a background to what happens in South Africa. Uh, they talk about the reintroduction of sovereign rights, the concept of self-government. Very, very important. The third point: sovereign rights and self-government. This is what is going to give inspiration to the black population in South Africa, who will now start, the African National Congress will now start talking in terms of rights, how the blacks of South Africa have a right to be a part of the government. They will talk about self-government, a self-government which also includes the black population, the colored population, and the Indian community of South Africa. Permission to every country to get raw material from a given country. There should be teamwork among all the countries regarding economic tie-ups. Citizens should be free from fear and free from the paucity of things. There should be liberty for every country to use the seas, and every country that attacks another country should be disarmed. So, not all of this is related to what is happening in South Africa, but as I said, point number third is really, really important. So, this particular charter of 1941 inspires the South African Congress and the people, the black community, people who were fighting for the rights of the black community in South Africa, and they come up with their own charter. Drawing inspiration from the Atlantic Charter, they come up with their own charter, and this particular charter is known as the African Claims Charter, the African Claims. Uh, it talked about complete citizenship for the blacks, how the blacks who were considered as second class or the third class citizens in South Africa, how they should be given equal citizenship at par with the white population. They should have the authority to own land, a right which was taken away by the Land Act in 1917. So they asked for the right to own land. They also talk about the annulment of prejudicial laws, the repressive laws, the cancellation of all the repressive laws which the white government of South Africa was bringing in. Now, it also brings brings to notice the notion of fundamental rights and the rights of self-determination of the black population. As I said, that they're drawing inspiration from the Atlantic Charter. So the fact that the Atlantic Charter mentions about rights, even the black community in South Africa very, very, strongly start demanding fundamental rights for themselves. Not that before this particular incident they were not demanding it, they were doing it. They were asking for fundamental rights. They were asking for all kinds of rights at par with white population. But this becomes more stronger by every such act, which they do in an organized manner. After this, a convention is called, a meeting is called, which is known as a congress is called, of various communities, and they bring together another charter, which is known as the Freedom Charter. Now, this charter is formed after in 1955, after the Congress of the People was held, and this particular charter, the Freedom Charter, is in some way the precursor or the basic draft, a preliminary draft of the constitution which South Africa is going to adopt in 1996. So 1996, after the ending of the apartheid in South Africa, when it becomes a democratic, anti-racial country, the constitution which they then adopt, a precursor, a preliminary draft, it was there. It was based on this Freedom Charter. It was convened. This Congress of People was convened by the National Action Council. It was attended by thousands of people, and after the ending of the meeting, they made a document which was known as a Freedom Charter. It is very interesting to go through, what this charter looked like. The Freedom Charter, which they brought in 1955. There are no more charters. We have talked about the African Claims Charter and the Freedom Charter, which comes in 1955. Now, the first paragraph of this Freedom Charter is very interesting, and it speaks for the struggle. What the struggle of the black population stood for. I'm going to read the first paragraph of this Freedom Charter. It said, "We, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white and black, and that no government can justify, claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people. That our people have been robbed of their birthright to land, liberty, and peace by a form of government founded on this, that our country will never be prosperous or free until all our people live in brotherhood, enjoying equal rights and opportunities. That only a democratic state based on the will of the people can secure to all their birthright without distinction of color, race, sex, or belief." This is the Freedom Charter, the opening paragraph of the Freedom Charter of 1955. Now, this gives us a glimpse of what the African National Congress of South Africa is going to fight for in the next 30-40 years. Okay, so we have gone through the African Claims Charter. We have talked about the Freedom Charter. Now, this Freedom Charter, why was it brought in? It was brought in, the date of the Freedom Charter is 1955. As you saw, June 26, 1955 is when the Freedom Charter is brought in. This is brought in because, as we have been talking about, in 1948, National Party comes to power in South Africa. This National Party is an all-whites party, and it brings in, right when it comes to power, it brings in various repressive acts. Acts like suppression of communism, because I told you, that the communists were trying to organize the workers and the peasants and giving them, telling them how a native republic would be established. So there was this suspicion of the communism spreading in South Africa. So a Suppression of Communism Act brought in 1951, Groups Area Act 1950. Now this Groups Area Act is important. We are going to talk about it further, how it is brought down ultimately. Also Separate Registrations of Voters Act in 1951, Bantu Authorities Act, Stock Limitation Act. Now all these acts, the series of acts, are brought in 1948. The National Party government comes to power, and in the next 2-3 years of it being in power, it starts bringing in all these acts which were very, very repressive against the black population, and also to the colored and the Indian population of South Africa. Now, this was something which the black population and other communities took very, very strongly. They took note of it, and they started resisting themselves. They launched a campaign against defying all these acts which this government was bringing in. So 50 and 51, all these acts were brought in, and the various other populations, the black population, the colored population, and people of the Indian origin, they started protesting against these acts which were brought in. And it was in response to these acts that a Congress of People was called in, which was attended by by thousands of people. A council was convened known as the National Action Council. Now, this council was a multiracial organization. It had people from various different races, and it was a result of this particular Congress, this particular National Action Council, that the Freedom Charter was formed. The Freedom Charter, which we just looked at, or the first paragraph of the Freedom Charter, which I just read to all of you. Now, they now the movement of the black population of South Africa was becoming much more organized, much more stronger, and they were trying to organize themselves by various ways. And these meetings which were being conducted, these congresses which were being conducted, started becoming an annual affair. They became annual. Every year they would have a congress like this. And also there were demands that how more of these meetings are required to gather more support, to reach out to greater parts of the population, so that there should be more and more people should join in with this the movement of the black population. Another conference was held in 1960, at Orlando in Swato. Where various African leaders met. Certain members of the white community also met in this meeting, and this was known as the All-In Conference, because all were in, people from various sections, the black community, the white community, the various people were included in this particular All-In Congress. This was set up, this was formed in 1960, this was held in 1961. So the call was made in 1960, and this conference was held in 1961. So various representatives from various communities representing various religions came from different sections of the society, from different political groups. All of them came together in 1961 in this All-In Congress, and it was decided that they are going to give their demands, what they want from this National Party government which is there in power. They want to give them their demands what are the changes that they would want to see in the society. And two major demands were establishment of a democracy and how South Africa should be a non-racial country, so establishing a non-racial society. Now, all these demands were put in place, and here the person who took these demands to the then Prime Minister of South Africa, who was Hendrik Verwoerd. He was the Prime Minister of South Africa from 1958 to 61, Hendrik. Now, the demands were taken from this all-in conference, the demands of these people, whatever was decided in the Congress about the formation of a democratic non-racial society in South Africa, were taken to Hendrik by Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela is a name which many of us are aware of. He is the leader, who has stood for, who took the long struggle in South Africa against the apartheid, against the racially segregating regime, against this policy of separation between blacks and whites. So he's a prominent figure. He's a major leader of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So Nelson Mandela takes these demands to Hendrik. A letter was drafted by him and sent to the Prime Minister, which said that if you do not take into consideration our demands, there will be chaos in the society, and the black community is trying to organize itself. So please pay attention. We want peace. We want our demands. We want equal rights. We want a democracy. We want a society which does not, distinguishes on the basis of color. We want a society which is equal, which in which opportunity is provided to all of them, or to the entire population. So they met so this letter was sent to Hendrik, the government, who was the Prime Minister of the government of the National Party. The South African government declared the South Africa as a republic. So South Africa is declared as a republic, but this republic is established by only taking into consideration the all-white referendum. So this letter which was sent in by the National Convention, this National Convention was against the setting up of republic. But a republic is established. The National Convention is wants the setting up of democracy in South Africa, but democracy and a non-racial society is not established. Instead, what is established is a republic. And this republic is established by after an all-white referendum. So the demands of the black community, which were expressed in the form of this letter to the Prime Minister, were not paid attention to. And this is a time, when it was decided that, that this particular government is not going to look into the efforts, is not going to think about the majority of the population, which comprises of blacks, which comprises of Indians, which comprises of the colored population. And this decided for them that how their fight for equal rights, the fight against this separation on the basis of race, is going to be a very, very long fight. We will take a short break of let's say 2 minutes. I'll just have water and then I'll join you back. Okay. So we were talking about how the demands of the black community were not paid attention to, and instead of establishing a democratic form of government, giving all kinds of rights to the black population and various other populations of South Africa, the National Party government established a republic, and this was established after a all-white referendum. Now let us look at, briefly look at. We'll continue what happens after that. This is 1960s that we are talking about. This is from this time onwards. This particular personality, Nelson Mandela. You can see the picture. I've shared the screen. He is the prominent figure of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. He was born in 1918, and So he was a political leader. He was a revolutionary. He remained more for the most part of the anti-apartheid struggle. Uh, he was a very he was inspired by the ideals of Mahatma Gandhi. And was talked about how non-violence is extremely important in the struggle against against apartheid in South Africa. He became the president of South Africa in 1994 and remained in power till 1999. He was the country's first black head of the state and first elected in a fully representative democratic election. So the first time when the fully representative democratic elections were held in South Africa, Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa as a result of that. He also wrote a book known as The Long Walk to Freedom. This long walk is quite, apt to the term because right from 1948 to as with the beginning of apartheid as a state policy till 1940 till 1996, and specifically, for Nelson Mandela from 1960 to 1996, this long years to achieving a non-racial society in South Africa. He comprised all his experiences, what he went through, what this struggle was like in his book, Long Walk to Freedom. Okay, now we will come back to what we were discussing. We were discussing how these demands were not paid much attention to, and what happens as a result is that the African National Congress, because they realized that this particular party of this particular party, the National Party, is not going to pay much attention to our demands of the black community, and we will have to fight. We'll have to have a long fight to our freedom, to a state wherein we get equal rights. So once they decided this, the struggle became much more intense. Uh, there was a period of a 30-year from 1960 to 1990, almost 30 years civil war. This civil war, what is a civil war? Civil war is a war between the state, between the government and the civilian population. So what emerged after this establishment of republic in 1960 was a civil war between the population of South Africa and the government of that time. The African National Congress, the major political party, was banned by the government. To contain the activities of the black population, it banned the African National Congress, and the most of the political bodies of the Africans their rights were taken away. They were not allowed to gather, no right to assembly. They could not assemble. People could not present their demands, etc. So all this was done. Very repressive policies by the National Party government. And this made the African people, the black community of Africa, realize that the government has started using such repressive measures that it is not possible to fight for equal rights, fight for a society which is going to be a non-racially segregated society, a society which is going to be democratic. This made them realize that this fight will have to be an armed fight. And this is when the fight of the African people for a the fight of the African people, which was till now a non-violent fight, becomes violent because they start taking up arms. This is where it becomes different from the Indian National Congress, from the fight of the Indian population for their freedom from the British, which remained largely without arms, non-violent. It remained largely non-violent. But the fight of the African people against the government at that time, because they were not willing to listen to any of the demands, they were not willing for any kind of deliberations, they were not willing for any kind of dialogue. And this is when this particular fight for equality becomes extremely violent. People start taking up arms, and there is a development of insurgency, armed struggle in South Africa to attain a society which is equitable, which has equality, which gives equality to all its citizens. So basically, a fight against the apartheid which was there in South Africa. After the banning of Indian African National Congress and the bodies of various blacks and other political bodies of blacks and colored people of South Africa, what the next step taken by this particular government was to end, or was to bring down the African language, the language of the African population, as the medium of instruction in various in various schools, etc. And this attempt was not taken was taken by the government, was opposed very seriously by the student community, and they came up. There was extremely violent resistance by the students of South Africa in 1976, and there was even more violent repression by the state on the students, and hundreds of students were killed when the government tried to contain this resistance of the students. When the government changed the medium of instruction, they tried to remove the African language from the medium of instruction. The students started resisting. The government opposed this very strongly, and it broke down the movement of the students, and a large number of students were killed, and there was violence everywhere in South Africa, a number of killings. And this is a time when a number of blacks would leave the country, realizing how the atmosphere is no longer safe, how it is no longer safe to live in South Africa. So they will leave their country, and the struggle was slowly becoming more and more aggressive. The more the National Party was trying to contain the demands, the more repressive the government of National Party was, more stronger the movement of the blacks grew to get equality, to get their fight against apartheid became much more stronger. This is a time, because this fight, this struggle, this movement, despite African National Congress being banned, despite this repressive killings of hundreds of students, the white government of the National Party realized that this is we cannot reach any solution with this, and we need to bringing certain reforms to bring a change in the situation which is prevalent in South Africa right now. And at this time in 1978, somebody known as a person known as P.W. Botha comes to power. He becomes the Prime Minister of South Africa, and he also later becomes the president. He comes to power, and he he comes to power, and he has this task of controlling this movement of black population, their movement against apartheid. He has to control this movement, contain this movement, and he begins he adopts a policy of which is dual. He is also trying to bring in reform, but this reform is not an actual reform. He is only going to talk in terms of reform, and he is also at the same time being very repressive. He deals with all these struggles in a very strict manner. He is very despotic. So this new government, when they realize that this struggle cannot be contained, they adopt this dual policy. हम रिफॉर्म भी करेंगे, हम सुधार की भी बात करेंगे, और साथ-साथ सुधार के साथ-साथ हम इस मूवमेंट को तोड़ने की, इस मूवमेंट को खत्म करने की, जितनी भी मिलिट्री लगे, जितनी भी आर्मी लगे, इस मूवमेंट को हम खत्म करने की कोशिश करेंगे. So let's talk about the reform side first. So for reforming the system and to contain the demand of the black population, a separate department was established by P.W. Botha. This department was known as the Department of Constitutional Development and Planning. This was a major step. Constitutional development, that the constitution which South Africa is going to adopt, we are going to start a department which is going to lead to the Constitution of South Africa. So the department itself was known as the Department of Constitutional Development and Planning. Along with this, they also created another, a setup, a multi-layered interdepartmental configuration known as National Security Management System, NSMS, National Security Management System. Two things he's bringing: a Department for Constitutional Development and also National Security Management System. This National Security Management System was was given this major task of resolving the problems of the black community, not to be able to giving in to their demands, not that all the demands of the black community will be would be heard and they would be given to them whatever they were asking for, but to resolve the issues, to make the situation more peaceful, to end this turmoil which has come into society and is also affecting the economy of South Africa, to contain that people, the black population of South Africa should not come to the streets. Their struggle which has come to the streets, wherein their people are fighting, protesting, a movement has emerged. How to cut down, bring down this movement of the black population. In 1983, as part of all these reforms, as I said, he will be reforming on one end, and on the other end, he will also be very, very repressively trying to break down the movement of the black population. So in 1983, he starts, talking in terms of constitutional development, the department that he has established. And a tricameral parliament is established, a tricameral parliament and a council of the president. Two bodies are established. Council of the president is guided by a council, so that is the council of the president. What is a tricameral parliament? Tricameral parliament is a parliament which has three houses, not two but three. Like in India, we have bicameral parliament, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Like in Britain, there are two, Britain also has bicameral parliament, House of Commons and House of Lords. What South Africa in 1883, as part of the constitutional reforms, establishes is a tricameral parliament, and this parliament comprises of three houses. One, White House of Assembly. Second, the Colored House of Representatives. Third, the Indian House of Delegates. First is the white, second is the colored, and the third is the Indian House of Delegates. The entire fight, the entire movement, the majority of people in the movement were blacks, and the blacks were not included in this parliament. So obviously, a constitutional reform like this is not going to stop the black population from revolting. It is not going to bring in peace, and it is not going to resolve the demands of the black population when you do not even include them. You talk in terms of having a constitution which is tricameral, wherein you have tried to make it more representative, try to include people from various other communities, but blacks are absolutely out. And also this tricameral parliament which was established, the three bodies, the white and the colored and the Indians, were in the members. The membership was almost half. So the whites comprised of almost 180 members, 178 members. The colored were almost half of it, so around 90. And Indian delegates were half of colored also, so around 40-45. So the majority of the delegates in this new parliamentarians were again going to be whites. So this again is not going to bring in much much changes to the situation, and the situation at this time continued to become much more violent. People started taking up arms, and they were not able to contain the movement of the black population. The NSMS, the National Security Management System, also tried to bring in certain changes. What they tried, their attempt was This is what the Department of Constitutional Development did, the tricameral parliament. What NSMS, the National Security Management System, what they did was to resolve the situation by including certain members of the black community. Now, these certain members of the black community which were involved in talks with the Botha's government, the Botha, the president of South Africa, these black members which were included were not the same leaders of the black movement, because most of the leaders were imprisoned, they were in jail. And also those leaders who were out, these were not the people who were included by Botha's government, but certain other black members from the aristocratic land owning black community, people who were living in the urban areas, who did not even know what the blacks exactly did not represent the struggles of the black people. So a small pocket of black elites was included by the National Security Management System. And they thought that if we are going to include some members of the black population, maybe this black movement will subside, it will settle down. But that did not happen, because these these people who were included were known as urban insiders, black people who are living in urban areas, and they are insiders because they represent the black population, so they were called the urban insiders. The NSMS was trying to bring in the various reforms at this time, and but most of these reforms did not reach any conclusion, and what they reached was a situation of dead end. A dead end was reached, and these reforms were not able to bring in or contain the movement of the black population, because they were not satisfied at whatever Botha's government was doing at this juncture. So they felt that these attempts by Botha's governments are not adequate, and they do not stand for what the movement is asking for. They are not aiming in terms of ending apartheid in any way. So this began, this intensified, the black population intensified the armed struggle against the National Party government. And by the middle of 1980s, they started using landmines, a number of attacks on the government on several forms, several, whatever the governmental organizations. The number of attacks escalated every year, and the African National Congress declared 1986 as the year of People's Army. That this is the year of People's Army, and we need to fight a people's war, an armed struggle. Common people, common human beings need to take up arms against against this particular government of the National Party, because this government is not going to listen to our demands if they are peaceful. So this year of People's War, 1986, People's War, the armed struggle was converted into People's War, and there was the year itself was declared as the year of People's Army. Now there were attempts by the Botha's government. They realized that the situation is going out of hand. In 1985, there were attempts at negotiations between Nelson Mandela and some delegates of Botha's government. And there were two alternatives which were thought out of these discussions between Nelson Mandela and representatives of Botha's government. The two alternatives were, first one was to release all the political prisoners, the black leaders which are there, which are imprisoned by this particular government, and start having some kind of talks and negotiations with them to decide on how the government is going to bring in a change. The government is going to adopt a constitution which will be a democratic constitution. And the alternative which was available to Botha was to handpick, again to pick up a few black representatives, as what the NSMS did earlier. The urban insiders. So you just pick up a few leaders and you start negotiating with them. then this is exactly what Botha did. So he did not choose the first alternative of releasing all the political leaders from prison. Instead, he adopted the second strategy of handpicking people from the black community and started the discussions with them. Uh, Now, this again was something which did not, which did not pacify the black struggles, the black population who was now coming to streets and then making it more and more, becoming more and more violent for the demands of democracy, demands to end anti-racial government to come to an end. So the movement was becoming more and more violent, and this is a time wherein this movement starts getting more and more attention, not just within the country, outside the country, but internationally as well. Especially the neighboring countries. The neighboring countries of South Africa in the 1980s, the late 1980s, start paying attention to what the then government of Botha was doing, and how this particular government is very, very repressive, and Botha's government felt that this particular movement is getting a lot of support from outside. The neighboring countries are giving support to this black movement, and the South African government of National Party started attacking its neighboring countries because they felt that they are trying to destabilize their government. So this is the time, late 1980s. You are not, the Botha's government is not paying attention to the black demands of the black leaders. Did not pay attention to what Nelson Mandela had to say, and starts attacking the neighboring regions. So again, a very, very futile effort on part of Botha to contain the movement, because it is not going to yield any kind of benefit. It is not going to bring in any new solution to the problem which South Africa was facing at that time. This is in April 1988, Botha started talking in terms of a fresh constitutional structure, that we are going to bring in a new constitution, which can which can either be federal or co-federal. What is a federal constitution? Federalism means wherein the certain smaller units representing different regions combined together, and a union of these federations is formed. So Botha has started to talk in terms of these. And they said, and he also suggested in 1988 that we are willing to include the black South Africans till the members of the cabinet ministers. So certain black people from the black community can become members of the cabinet. They can become cabinet ministers. Now, these various discussions were not yielding any kind of, conclusive solution to the problem which South Africa was facing at this time. And there were various bills which were drafted one after the other in 1988. In 1988, various bills are drafted, and also, there are discussions between the black leaders, between how they need to organize themselves further, and on the part of the government also, the government is also trying to bring in certain reforms which may contain the black movement. So if you remember, we talked about the Group Areas Act of when the National Party came to power in 1948. They introduced this act, series of act, suppression of communism, Group Areas Act, Stock Act, etc. So they abolished or abrogated the limitations of Group Area Act, the Group A. So they were bringing in these small reforms, and by this time, the colored population, the Indian population, the African population of South Africa was not willing to accept these token reforms which Botha's government was doing, and they wanted a total drastic change in the situation, and they wanted their demand of establishing a non-racially segregated society, a non-racially segregated a government which does not stand for apathy. So they were asking for such things, and but they were not willing to accept anything less than this. So these negotiations and these small token negotiations attempts which are done by Botha's governments did not yield any kind of solution to the problem. At this is a time when ANC started printing a number of pamphlets. They started organizing a number of meetings, deliberations for almost 2 years, from 1988 to 1990. And several other parties were formed at this juncture. There was a party known as Progressive Federal Party, PFP. This was founded in 1977. This party was also opposed to apartheid as the African National Congress. So the number of political parties is increasing in South Africa. Most of these political parties support that apartheid should go. They were opposed to apartheid, and they said that it should be brought down. uh, and the at this is the time when the National Party was planning to conduct elections, and they wanted after the elections, a new head is going to come in place. His name is Frederick Willem Clerk. But before these elections, an announcement is made on June 29th in 1989. In 1989, an announcement is made by the National Party before the elections which were being conducted of a 5-year plan. Now, what is that plan? Not 5-year plan, understanding. The 5-year plan talks in terms of how, in the period of 5 years, they are going to bring in a very a different constitution which will have certain rights for the black population. And so they basically created that how they are going to include the black population in the running of the South African country, in the government of South Africa, and also bring in certain, giving in certain rights to the black population, to the colored population, to the Indian population in South Africa. So this 5-year plan was a black community, because they were not willing to have, to have again, a 5-year period from 1989 wherein nothing would get done. So this is, the National Party, through these attempts, was trying to portray itself that how people friendly it has become, how it is trying to pay more attention to the demands of the black population, and how it is it is concerned about the struggles of the black population. And this is also time, because elections were being conducted. Several other parties like the Democratic Party will be launched in South Africa. So various the atmosphere in the late 1980s, 1989, becomes extremely politically charged up, and this is also the time wherein internationally, a number, as I told you earlier, also in 1988, South African government attacked its neighboring countries because it felt that these neighboring countries are trying to strengthen the backbone in South Africa and trying to destabilize their government. In 1989, internationally, a number of powerful countries in South Africa. Internationally, countries realize that South Africa has a form of government which is not liked by the majority of its population, and this government is being very, very repressive, using arms, army against its civilian population. So internationally, a lot of the government in terms of implementing sanctions by other nations. So she said that if you are not going to bring in reforms, we are going to implement, we are going to bring in sanctions against your country. What are sanctions? Sanctions are a tool which are used by powerful countries to get to get a particular partner internationally. So sanctions is that if you don't do this, do not what we are asking you to do. If you do not take care of administration rights to your population, we may not allow countries to trade with you. Pressure can be built of trade relations in terms of what the stopping imports. So this pressure was being built up on South Africa by other countries in the late 1980s, 1989 to be specific. US at this time, asked the government of South Africa to lift the ban on all the political parties, end the state of not possible. Also asked the US government, also asked South Africa to end all the discriminatory laws that they had in place before June 1990. It gave them a time that you have to draft a new constitution before 1990. Uh, so internationally, this pressure is built, and as I said, number of political parties were coming to were beginning to be formed. Progressive Party was one, Democratic Party was the other, and there was something known as the Inkatha Freedom Party. All these begin to negotiate, with the government at that time, and finally, it is, as I said, Frederick Willem de Klerk who comes to power of South Africa, and it is Klerk under whose presidentship South Africa is going to end apartheid. He was the last president of the apartheid government. He made the transition from apartheid government to a non-apartheid, anti-apartheid, democratic South Africa. He was the transitional president, Klerk. So he held a meeting in 1989 with other, leaders of other parties, prominent political prisoners, various leaders which are put into uh, prison due to whatever struggles they were leading. And he did a meeting with these all these leaders, and talks were being held about giving of fundamental rights, of giving of political rights to all the citizens, and that in he was being told by other countries, by these various leaders, that no country about to be in place, which is only supported by the by the minority. So if the majority of the population is against the government, you cannot stay in power without using arms. You cannot stay in power without using your army, without using your military. So this negotiations between Clerk's government and the various other political parties began, and as a result, a meeting was held in 1991. A conference was held. This conference was known as the Conference for Democratic South Africa, also known as CODESA. CODESA was held in the month of December 1991. I would want to show you Clerk here, if I can. Give me a moment. As I said, that he is the transitional president. He's the president under whose presidentship South Africa is going to end its apartheid regime and become democratic. I hope you can see his image here. Just 5 more minutes and I'll conclude. Okay, so that was Clerk. And he, as I've already said, that negotiations for establishing a democratic constitution began under his leadership. CODESA was formed in December 1991, and the meetings of CODESA ultimately remained unsuccessful. Why? Because the negotiations between National Party on one hand and African National Congress on the other hand did not reach any conclusion because their viewpoints were very, very different. And again, this the deadlock which emerged could not be solved. And at the same time, the bloodshed which was there in the country, the conflict which was going on in the country continued, and another conciliation was reached in which it was decided that a multi-party negotiation progress would begin. A record of understanding was reached in 1992 between the National Party and the African National Congress. In 1992, decided that we are going to reach an understanding. and a multi-party national process was established in 1993. And this is very, very important. MPNP, multi-party negotiation process. This multi-party negotiation process came up with 34 principles for the constitutions. The constitution which South Africa was going to adopt, they came up with principles, and these principles were taken from the constitutions of various different democratic countries at that juncture, which existed in 1993. So it was decided that whatever constitution we are going to adopt, it should have these 34 constitutional principles. The first, an interim constitution was established based on these 34 principles, and this constitution was adopted in 1993, December 1993, and the first democratic elections were conducted in April 27, 1994, on the same day on which the constitution came to power. And it is on the basis of this, constitution that Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. Now, this constitution gave rights to all South Africans. It talked about, having an independent judiciary. That there should be an independent judiciary. It also talked about the supremacy of the constitution, that whatever the constitution we are going to adopt, we have adopted. Now, this constitution on the basis of which this government was formed was known as the Interim Constitution. It was not yet the final constitution. So it was said that whatever constitution we are going to adopt, the supremacy of that constitution is going to remain the main thing for South Africa, that this, nothing can go beyond what will be enshrined in the constitution which we adopt. The constitution talked about, giving rights to people of all various communities, blacks, whites, colored, Indians, and it said that it was said that the supremacy of the constitution is the utmost important thing, and who was given the right to strike down any law which tries to bring down the supremacy of the constitution? The judiciary. Just like in India, the judiciary has the power to bring in any law which which tries to go against the ethos of the constitution. Similarly, this right was given to judiciary. A separate judiciary was established in South Africa on the basis of this new constitution, an interim constitution which was finalized in South Africa. Along with this, there were the centralized powers which existed before. During the time of National Party, the powers were concentrated in the hands of the National Party. All the powers to legislate, powers to come up with acts, the power to execute the acts, all the powers were constituted in the hands of the National Party. Now, attempts were made to diversify these powers, to bring in, to separate these powers into various different structures. And as I said, the judiciary was given the power to bring in any law which goes against the ethos of the Constitution of South Africa. Finally, the constitution was adopted in 1996, on May 8th, 1996. And this constitution was sent to the Constitutional Court for ratification, that, this is the constitution that we have adopted, and please ratify this. Interestingly, this twist and tale of South Africa reaching a democratic country did not come to an end, because this Constitutional Court refused to accept this new constitution and said that it is not in tune with the multi-party negotiation process. The 34 constitutional principles which they adopted by studying the various constitutions of the democratic constitutions of the world, the Constitution Court felt that this constitution does not include or is not in tune with those 34 principles. So it was again sent back. There were certain changes which were made to make it in tune with make it agree with the principles of multi-party negotiation process of 1993. And this amended constitution was again, brought in and approved by the Constitutional Court on 10th December 1996, and finally in February 1997, this new constitution came to power in South Africa. Was brought to effect in South Africa. So this journey of whatever about 100 years that we have covered in these 2 hours, specifically from 1948 to 1996, the reign of the National Party, how it started bringing in repressive measures, how African National Party was banned in 1960, how there were attempts to end take away, ban, abolish the African language, the support, how the movement turns violent, the support which the international organizations were getting in, the negotiations which began, and how every negotiation would also be followed by repressive measures on the part of the government, which tried to, on one hand, which said that it wants to do reform, and on the other hand, what it was also doing was breaking the back of this black movement. But it was not successful in doing so, and ultimately under de Klerk they had to agree to negotiations, and CODESA was formed, and CODESA didn't work. After that, multi-party negotiation process was formed in 1993, and ultimately, as a result of all these negotiations in 1996, the amended constitution was put in place. I hope you have got some grasp of what apartheid was, what it meant in the history of South Africa, and how it was based on the idea of race. It separated the black race from blacks and other colored population, and also Indians, from the whites. It was repressive, and how the African National Party, African National Congress, along with certain other political parties, but mainly the African National Congress, led a very long struggle to end apartheid in South Africa. Obviously, Nelson Mandela being one of the major prominent leader of this movement in South Africa. Thank you. I conclude here, and I would move to the question and answers now and see what are the relevant questions, and would try to answer those questions. This video will be available. I'll add this video and PowerPoint PPT also to this. It will be available on your Microsoft Teams dashboard. Okay. Okay. Somebody has asked that, it is not true that the whites and the blacks had a grudge against each other. Maybe not all whites and not all blacks, had a grudge against each other. The communities are, internally, as I said, are very, very diverse. And also the fact that, I did speak about certain moderate white leaders and how there were negotiations which were held with the white leaders also. They were also, as Schreiner had said, that this union which we are aspiring to make is a union without honor, a union which does not honor the rights of blacks, of colored population, of other people who comprise South Africa. So yes, there were different kinds of voices by the whites as well, and also the urban insiders, which Botha tried to include in the government and tried to negotiate with them in order to pacify the demands of the black movement. So there were all kinds of people from the black community, and there were also all kinds of people in the white community also. They were and they held different political viewpoints. And but this is not to say that they do not had enmity towards each other. I think the enmity of the South African population, the black South African population, was not directed against the whites, but this form of government which gave certain privileges to the whites and not to the blacks, the rights which were given to the whites. So it was a very, very fundamental a struggle on the very fundamental point that you're giving all these privileges to the whites and not to the blacks. So it wasn't in that way directed to the white population. Yes, there would be events, there would be in which it would come against the white population, especially the violent acts, but it was against this state policy. The blacks were against the policy of the state, that how can you give privilege to the whites or just on the basis of their color, on the basis of their race. We should also have equal rights, and they started talking in terms of fundamental rights right after the forming of the Freedom Charter in 1955. What kind of question would come in the exam? What was the struggle? What is apartheid? What does it mean? How the role played by African National Congress in the fight against apartheid, or basically in what we have discussed today. Okay, another question is, the Boer War was won by the British and still they allowed the formation of the Free South African nation. Why? Uh, very interesting. I would not know exactly why, but I can tell you that the fact that the British went through, so many losses in that particular war. They may have ultimately won the war because they had immense, manpower, immense resources at their disposal. But the war was led very, very effectively by the state, by the whites of Transvaal and Orange Free State. So it was a decisive war for the British because they did win the war, but it was also a decisive war for the native population, the native white population, because they realized that they cannot hold, and there was not much, like when you want to hold a particular colony against the against aspirations of the people who are living there, it involves a lot of shedding of resources in terms of army, in terms of police, by the colonial government. Maybe they were not willing to spend that kind of energies on in keeping South Africa as a colony, and also the fact that they already had various other colonies which were becoming more and more important, with the control was becoming more and more stronger. So they could not juggle with the colonies which were spread all across the world, in that sense. Like for American War of Independence, which was which was fought in 1776, long back, was ultimately they also won, but basically there the Americans won and the British lost. Here the British won, and they still decided that they'll let go of this colony, and they'll let South Africa being established as a separate nation. I hope it answers your question in some way. No, the South Africa Act. Okay, this is very important, sir. MPNP is a multi-party negotiation process. Multi-party negotiation process, which was formed after CODESA failed. CODESA was formed, and it failed because the negotiations were not able to work out the negotiations, and after which a multi-party negotiation process was started in 1993, and they adopted 34 constitutional principles by studying the constitutions of various democratic countries. There was one more important question which I did publish as well. Sir, what is the South Africa Act? Is it relates to the Land Act? Landlord Act? No, there is no Landlord Act. There is Land Act of 1917. The Land Act of 1917 took away the right of the black people to hold land, to buy land, to own land, and also their right to vote. It came in 1917. Okay, but South African Act is an act which comes before that. South African Act is an act which is drafted. The bill is drafted by the white community of South Africa, of these four different regions. The National Convention, which was formed by the white community from the regions of Transvaal, Natal, Cape Colony, and the Orange State. So the National Convention of the Whites of these four states was formed, and they drafted a South Africa Act. This act was passed. The draft was sent. It was passed by the National Convention. It was then sent to the British Parliament for the British to approve it. Just like, okay, to give you another example, like India also was freed. India also got it in independence because Britain passed an act, Independence of India Act 1947. There was an act which was passed by the British Parliament, Independence of India Act 1947. So the Parliament of Britain agreed to free India, the colony which India was. Similarly, South Africa Act was for the separation of South Africa from the British colony, and for it to be established as a separate country. Obviously, the separate country which was established of the separate country was by the whites, and which becomes the Republic of the Whites in 1960, and not the democracy which the Nelson Mandela and others were saying, suggesting that it should emerge as a democracy. So that is what the South Africa Act was, sent by the white community to Britain to pass the act so that South Africa could become a different nation. Okay, I think there are no more questions, so we can end the meeting, I guess. If there's anything else, all of you are free to ask. I shall share the readings and the PPT and the video. Everything will be available on your Microsoft dashboard. You can just go there and locate this, and this will be available. Thank you. I think I can end the meeting now, sir.